How many times have I been on the cutting room floor and I don't have something? If I want to make something extremely powerful in the cut, when is a good use of show and when is a good use of tell? Because it's really easy for us to get in this category of, I've got to give all of the context that I know about this particular person, theme, whatever it is, industry that we're going after, when really only people, if you want to give people something to think about, you give them a tiny piece and you give it out of order. And you do things that people aren't expecting because then the audience member goes and does the research themselves. So when are you going to show and when are you going to tell? And how does that affect the order? How does that affect the edit? That's stuff I'm thinking about as a director now. Editor turned director really is the key, because I started as an editor. Fixing, I think, other people's problems, which you did as well when we get hired. And fixing our own problems. That's a huge one. Like learning from, I think a good example would be In the Blood, which is the first thing that we ever worked on together. That's a project that I went in thinking was all about a business, the family business that they had run, that my wife's family had run, but not thinking about the people and the situations around what happened in that. And deeper, what motives drove people to do what they did, to make choices to be a part in that proximity that we dealt with of, and also loss and different things like that, right? Anyway, that's great. It's super important.
Right. And so what was the big, like, because I remember, you know, when you gave me all your briefings and whatnot for In the Blood, I remember, yeah, this is a business family story, or family business story. And then now that the cut is done and submitted to festivals, this is a family story.
Yeah, and even more so, it's almost like a biopic, because it's focused directly on not the whole family, but Lou Carlo, who's the archetype for all of the other people that when we started filming, okay, these are the family business people right now, Emma's uncles and aunts. These are the people. I'm going to capture all of them. I was looking at it this big. I was looking at it like this when we first shot. Not realizing once I started getting feedback that the story started somewhere else. And it started with the patriarch of the family, Grandpa. And we happened to be in these moments, and I think the biggest pivot I made was that we got to shoot his last interview and he died 2 months later. And that shook me to my core, because it made me think through, okay, first of all, fragile, we've been talking about this a lot, but fragility to life, but then also these are like some of his last words. It was almost like he was imparting wisdom on us in that interview. That I look at that interview now and I'm like, he was saying something to me in that moment. I was interviewing. I was asking retrospective history of what happened, and he was giving me the present, which is what I needed really bad, because I wasn't asking him. I was not asking him my thoughts. There was some of it, but it was mostly what happened this year, what was that kind of thing that we all start out doing. And I think what we ended up doing in the final cut, to answer your question, is we scaled that back, and I figured out what parts of the information about the track needed to be said versus what he was trying to say, and what areas we can sum little sections up instead of having somebody describe it for 15 minutes and just make it meaningful to me and to other people. I mean, it's personal for me. It became personal the more I worked on it, but I had to figure out what my journey and path was through what I was learning from them. So it's almost retrospective. For me, it was a retrospective process. It was opposite what a lot of directors do, like this says, going into story before you even shoot a doc.
Before, you were looking at it like this.
Yeah.
And it's funny because you were looking at it like this and trying to look at a whole big world and a whole big story through a f/22 600 millimeter lens, right? Like you're looking at a really big spectrum what happens is you're distant from it and you distance the audience from it because you're telling them
Yeah.
Here's what happened in this family business. Like,
Yeah.
you're just telling at that point, versus what you did is you switched that lens to a 32 millimeter, and you
Wide
open, and you went right up to Lou Carlo's face.
Yeah.
And instead of telling the audience this is what Lou did,
Yeah.
you showed the audience this is what Lou meant.
Yeah.
I think
And you make people feel through that.
exactly. So instead of telling them this is the business, this is how it started, this is why it's so amazing, you just told them, hey, just look at Lou, just look at his life, what he built, and just look at how much it meant for everyone around him. And there's a lesson there through just showing what's already there.
I was going to say that you're offering, when you build a cut around show, you're basically saying, form your own opinion. I'm a journalist as a director, ultimately, when it comes to docs. I'm going to go do my research. I did my research for 4 years, but it didn't connect with me. That, like you said, I was looking at the world from the atmosphere and saying, I got to tell all of this. Instead of being in that room in Lebanon, Ohio in 2021. But it took me being in my room in 2024 in Greenville, South Carolina, not even connected to when we started shooting. It's for me to say, look at my life journey of where God held us, left the safety net of home, and we move to then restructure how I saw Lou in his life. And that to me is like the biggest, honestly, the biggest thing that you can do for show, because I'm just showing you pieces of my life that happened. And I'm showing you how much I actually realized I was like him, right? Those are like, it's a relational thing. If you don't make somebody feel, they're not gonna know how to. That's why I think like true crime stuff is very, like docs are really interesting, because they're retelling a story that already happened and the drama that ensued, but you're gripped not from the sense of a feel good. It's more of a what's gonna happen. And I think it's way harder to do the play that we did in the Blood, because there isn't anything that radical about it. It's just life, and it's just people, and it's just, honestly, mistakes or misfortune that happened to a family that led them to learn how to love each other through the head of the family, which is something that we're missing in society and culture in a lot of ways right now.
David Mamet wrote this amazing book called On Directing Film. David says here, Nick, a young fellow in his 30s with a flair for the unusual. You can't film it. How do you film it? Jody, a brash hipster who's been sitting on the bench for 30 hours. How do you film that? Can't be done, other than through narration. Visual, Jody looks at a watch. Dissolve, it is now 30 hours later. Verbal, well, as hip as I am, it's surely been a trial to have been sitting on this bench for the last 30 hours. Obviously, that line doesn't work. It's cringy. He says, if you find that a point cannot be made without narration, it is virtually certain that the point is unimportant to the story.
It's so crazy. Yeah.
Which is to say, the audience. The audience requires not information, but drama. Who then requires this information? This dreadful plotting narration that compromises all American film scripts.
That's some heavy stuff. It's true, though.
If you find that a point cannot be made without narration, it is virtually certain. I have an accent, by the way, so if I misspell words or mispronounce them, there you go. If you find that a point cannot be made without narration, it is virtually certain that the point is unimportant to the story.
And then you can save so much time in the edit. And I think that's so important, because I think we over-captured. We shot 13 terabytes, and we probably could have shot maybe 5, And I didn't need to ask everybody's life story, You realize that if you really get it dialed and you're focused, and those show tells, those beats, and it's laid out, that's the thing that people don't understand about docs, is docs are actually structured. That's something I didn't know, and now I am structuring them. And you're not lying because it's real life. You need it to be real life, but you do need to put structure in place, because otherwise you were just going to get everybody's full story, and every interview's an hour. And really, you probably only are going to use I think from In the Blood, I probably only used maybe 3% from each interview except for Lou and Linda, and that taught me so much about like I overshot everything. Go in knowing what you want to show and what you want to tell the audience. What are the pivot points, transitions especially? What are the transitions between scene to scene that are going to say, okay, I heard this thing, the audience, I heard this thing. Now, what are you going to try to make me feel so I understand what comes next? What are you going to make me think about? That's the thing that I never knew, and that's why transitions are so freaking hard. It's easy to find sound bites, but the transition to get that to the next spot, man, that's the hardest thing if you didn't plan it. If you didn't plan that right, you do have to, just like you're building an essay or writing a book, you do have to have those bridges. If you don't have those bridges in the edit, it dies, you know?
Yeah, and you also have to back up what you're trying to show the audience with your scenes and with your beats. And
yeah,
I was just thinking, like,
it's true.
If you wrote it in pre-production about a character, or the main character in your doc, for example, he's a man who loves his family and he's a hard worker. Well, if you narrate that, that's boring.
So boring.
If you go into a 10-minute scene where you describe when his son got into a car accident,
which is in the film,
right?
That says it without saying it.
Exactly. You're like, oh my gosh, this guy loves his business so much, but he would drop it in a heartbeat to be there for the people that he loves.
Yeah. It's shock value and it's misdirection that makes docs. Shock value mixed with deep storytelling mixed with misdirection. Because that's the whole throw a random scene at the beginning, throw somebody off the scent, hit them hard with the truth when they weren't expecting it, and you'll impact them. And that's a narrative concept. That's so many narratives have the twist ending. And you start thinking about that because you got to hook them at the beginning. Then how do you keep them? And then how do you hero's journey? How do you bring them from a place where they didn't know where something was, and a group goes out to find it, led by somebody, and then they find it or they don't find it, and they're met by opposition throughout the way. Like, that's just as much as that's a narrative concept, that's a doc concept. That's something that's like something I learned through all of this. You're just making it real life.
It's really sad because a lot of people think that documentaries is all telling. Like 100%. You're just telling the audience, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. It's really sad. Whereas films didn't become films as like a new concept. There's nothing new under the sun. It's just society got a new medium to tell stories, which was a camera, and the beautiful mixture of almost all the arts disciplines that exist, right? Like, that's film, which is why we love it so much. But stories existed before that. They existed in literature. Before they existed in literature, they existed in just this, like, just, sitting by the fire and talking about it.
There was no medium to consume it other than that. For
exactly.
A long time. Yeah. Folklore and all that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's funny because show is such a visual concept, but good books also show, not tell.
Even though you're reading words.
Exactly. So it's fun to retract yourself from, I'm a commercial filmmaker, I'm a documentary filmmaker, and just think of yourself as a storyteller. Like, you're doing a job that is way older than whenever the first picture was made in the early 1900s,